It was just another ordinary day at the office, or so it seemed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the rows of cubicles. But beneath the surface, tension was building, silent but thick, creeping its way through the workplace like an invisible storm on the horizon. There had been whispers in the air for weeks now, subtle hints that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until this one fateful encounter that everything would explode into full view. It started with a seemingly innocent conversation. A conversation that quickly turned into something darker, more dangerous, something that no one had seen coming. The manager, known for his sharp tongue and cold demeanor, had always been a bit of a mystery to the staff. On the surface, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that made him hard to ignore, but there were always rumors swirling around him, whispers about his temper, his strictness, and his questionable approach to leadership. But nobody expected what would happen when he locked eyes with one of his employees, a hard-working individual who had been dedicated to the job for years. That day, the atmosphere was charged, filled with the usual office chatter, until the manager called the employee into his office. It wasn't uncommon for him to request meetings, but this time felt different. The employee hesitated for a moment, sensing that something was off, but brushed it aside. After all, they had done nothing wrong. They had been working hard, staying late, hitting all their targets. What could possibly go wrong? As they walked into the manager's office, the door clicked shut behind them with a finality that made the air feel thick. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, the employee thought they might be able to cut through it with a joke or a smile. But there was no laughter today. The manager sat behind his desk, a cold, impassive look on his face. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "You've been underperforming," he said, his voice low, his eyes narrowing. "Your work has been sloppy. I've noticed some mistakes you've made lately, and it's not looking good." The employee was taken aback, confusion flooding their mind. They had been giving their all, working hard, meeting deadlines, putting in overtime. How could he say such things? "I don't understand." "I've been doing my best," the employee responded, trying to remain calm. But the manager's face twisted into something darker, something that made the room feel even colder. "Your best? Is that the excuse you're going to use now?" His voice grew louder, sharper. "Do you really think anyone here cares about your excuses? Do you think you're special just because of that?" He gestured vaguely, as if the answer was obvious, as if it didn't need to be said aloud. The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, the employee froze. Was he really going there? Was this really happening? The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as the manager's eyes bored into them, waiting for a response. The employee felt a lump form in their throat, their mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. But the words, those awful, hurtful words, hung in the air, lingering, suffocating everything around them. In that moment, it was clear that this wasn't just about performance. It wasn't about work at all. The manager wasn't criticizing the employee's skills or mistakes. He was attacking them. Attacking them in a way that made no sense, in a way that cut far deeper than anything related to the job. But just as quickly as the words were thrown out, the manager leaned back in his chair, a smug smile creeping across his face. "You're just like the rest of them, aren't you?" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Expecting special treatment, thinking you deserve things that you didn't earn." The employee's heart pounded in their chest, every fiber of their being screaming to run, to get out, to escape this nightmare. But they couldn't move. They couldn't react. All they could do was sit there, frozen, as the manager continued to deliver his cruel insults. And then, just as the employee thought it couldn't get any worse, the manager leaned forward, his voice a whisper, but one that cut through the air like a blade. "You'll never go far in this company. Not with that attitude. Not with that look of yours." It was a moment that would change everything. The employees stood there, stunned, their mind racing. How had it come to this? How had a simple performance review devolved into something so personal, so ugly? The room felt smaller, suffocating, the walls closing in on them. Every word, every insult, felt like a weight pressing down on their chest, making it harder to breathe. The manager smirked, sensing victory in the air. He had humiliated them, stripped them of their dignity, and left them feeling small, powerless. It was clear that this wasn't about work. It was about something much deeper. Something far more sinister. But just as the employee opened their mouth to say something, anything, to defend themselves, the manager's expression shifted. It was subtle, but the change was undeniable. There was a flicker of something fear, perhaps? Maybe even regret? Before the employee could speak, the door to the office opened, and in walked another figure, a witness to the tension that had just unfolded. But now, the question was no longer about the performance review. The question was, what would happen next? Would anyone believe what had just transpired? Would anyone stand up against the injustice that had just occurred? As the employee walked out of the office, head down, heart heavy, they knew that nothing would ever be the same. The manager's words, those hateful, dismissive words, would follow them. But what the employee didn't know was that this confrontation was just the beginning. The truth about what happened behind closed doors was far from being exposed, and the story was far from over. Who would stand up? Who would fight back? And would the manager finally be held accountable for his actions? The answers were still to come, but the tension had already set the stage for something that would leave everyone speechless. And as the employee walked away from the office, they couldn't help but wonder, was this the breaking point, or was the worst yet to come? The days that followed felt like a blur for the employee. Each morning, the walk to work felt longer, heavier, as if the weight of what had transpired in that office had somehow attached itself to every step they took. The manager's words echoed in their mind, an unrelenting voice that seemed to follow them everywhere. It was almost as if they could feel the eyes of their coworkers on them, judging, whispering, waiting for something to happen. No one knew exactly what had gone down in that office, but they all felt the ripple of tension that had been left in its wake. The employee tried to go about their days as usual, to pretend that everything was fine. They showed up early, worked diligently, did their best to keep their head down and push through the discomfort. But it wasn't easy. There were moments, small ones at first, where they would catch a glimpse of the manager, and that feeling of dread would settle in their stomach again. The manager's icy demeanor had always been unsettling, but now it felt like a looming cloud, always hanging overhead, always waiting to burst. And yet, as time went on, there was something even more unnerving in the way the manager behaved. He had always been cold and calculated, but now there was an air of unpredictability about him. His eyes lingered a little too long on the employee whenever their paths crossed in the office, and there was an unsettling tension in the way he would sometimes pass by their desk. It was as if the encounter in the office had shifted something between them, something dark and unspoken, and neither of them knew how to navigate it. For days, the employee couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. The more they tried to ignore it, the more it consumed their thoughts. Their coworkers, too, seemed to be walking on eggshells around them. They avoided eye contact, spoke in whispers, and quickly changed the subject whenever the employee entered a conversation. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to make the employee feel like an outsider, like everyone knew something they didn't. But what did they know? Was the manager's behavior an isolated incident, or was there something more going on beneath the surface? The employee couldn't help but feel like they were just one small piece in a much larger puzzle. They tried to focus on their work, to find some semblance of normalcy, but the growing sense of unease gnawed at them with each passing hour. Then, one day it happened. The employee was sitting at their desk, typing away on an assignment when they heard the manager's voice call out from across the room. At first, it seemed like just another routine request, nothing out of the ordinary. But the way the manager's voice carried this time was different, more authoritative, more demanding. "Come to my office," the manager said, his tone firm, devoid of the usual pretense of casualness. "Now." The words struck like a hammer, leaving the employee with no time to prepare, no time to gather their thoughts. They stood up, their legs trembling slightly, and made their way to the manager's office. It was the same cold, impersonal room as before, but today it felt different. There was an oppressive weight in the air, as if the very walls of the room had been steeped in tension. The manager was sitting behind his desk, staring at the computer screen, his back turned as the employee entered. He didn't acknowledge their presence at first, as if waiting for them to make the first move. But the silence was suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity, and the employee could feel their heart racing in their chest, their palms beginning to sweat. Finally, the manager turned around, his eyes cold and piercing. "Close the door," he said, his voice low and controlled. The employee did as instructed, the click of the door echoing in the silence that followed. When they turned back around, they found themselves staring into the manager's eyes, an intensity in them that sent a shiver down their spine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The employee could feel the weight of the silence hanging between them, thick and suffocating. What was going on? What did the manager want this time? The manager was the first to break the silence. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice cold, calculating. "I don't like what I see. You've been walking around here like you're above everyone else. Like you think you're entitled to something." The employee's throat went dry. "I'm just trying to do my job," they replied, their voice steady but strained. "I've been working hard." "I don't know what you mean." The manager smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Don't play dumb with me. You know exactly what I mean. You think you can just waltz in here, do the bare minimum, and expect everything handed to you? You think you deserve better than everyone else?" The employee opened their mouth to respond, but the words caught in their throat. What was he saying? How could he accuse them of such things when they had been working tirelessly, doing everything that had been asked of them? But the manager wasn't finished. His eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't belong here," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself more than to the employee. "People like you never do. You'll never make it in this world. Not in this company. Not in this life." The words hit harder than anything before, like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the attack on their work ethic, it was personal. It was a slap at who they were, at everything they stood for. The employee could feel the blood rush to their face, a hot fury rising within them, but they couldn't speak. They couldn't do anything but stand there, frozen in disbelief. The manager's eyes flickered with something, maybe a hint of satisfaction or maybe something darker. But before the employee could gather their thoughts, the door to the office swung open again. This time, it was another figure from the office, someone who had been around but who hadn't said much to the employee in the past. They looked from the manager to the employee, their eyes wide, almost as if they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. The manager's expression shifted instantly, like a switch had been flipped. The cold, calculating gaze turned into something more neutral, almost friendly. "Oh, it's you," he said, his voice suddenly light, casual. "Come on in. We're just having a little discussion here." But the employee could see it in the other person's eyes, the way they avoided looking directly at them, the way they shifted uncomfortably on their feet. It was clear that they had heard something. And for a moment, the employee wondered, was this person going to say something? Would they step forward, speak out, or would they let the manager get away with it? The door clicked shut behind the newcomer, and the tension in the room was palpable. The manager's demeanor had shifted back to its usual coldness, but something had changed. The employee could feel it. They knew that this was far from over. It wasn't just a matter of confronting the manager, it was a matter of what they would do next. And whatever it was It was going to change everything. The employee sat there, tense and silent, as the manager's attention was momentarily diverted by the new arrival. The newcomer had quickly settled into the conversation, as though nothing unusual had occurred. But the employee couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something was happening that they didn't fully understand. The shift in the manager's attitude was so sudden, so calculated, it was impossible to ignore. It was as though the manager had flipped a switch, changing from a cold, domineering presence to an almost charming, approachable figure in the blink of an eye. The employee felt like they were stuck in some twisted game, watching as the rules shifted right before their eyes, and they were never told what they were in the first place. The new person in the room, a colleague who had barely interacted with the employee before, seemed completely oblivious to the tension that had just transpired. They chatted with the manager, nodding politely, and the employee couldn't help but feel a pang of isolation. Why didn't anyone see the truth? Why was everyone so willing to pretend that things were normal when it was clear that something was deeply wrong? As the conversation dragged on, the employee's thoughts wandered. They thought about the past few weeks, how everything had seemed just fine before that encounter with the manager. It had all seemed so ordinary, so predictable. They had shown up, done their work, and kept their head down. But now, everything felt different. The air was heavy with uncertainty, and no matter how hard they tried to focus, their mind kept returning to the manager's cruel words. But what really troubled them was something more elusive, the subtle but unmistakable shift in the office culture. It wasn't just about the manager anymore, it was about how the rest of the team seemed to respond to him. How everyone had been suddenly walking on eggshells, how conversations paused when they walked by, how their colleagues' eyes would dart away when they looked at them. It was as if there was a collective understanding, an unspoken agreement, that they were somehow different now, marked in some way. And then there was the strange feeling that maybe the manager wasn't working alone in his cruelty. Maybe, just maybe, there was something more at play here, something far more insidious than a personal grudge or petty office politics. The employee had caught glimpses of strange interactions between the manager and certain people, side glances, whispered words, strange smiles. It was almost as if there was a web of complicity being woven in front of them, and they were too slow to realize it. The employee's thoughts were interrupted when the manager turned back to them. There was a tightness in his expression, a forced pleasantness, as if he were trying to maintain some semblance of control. "You're still here, I see," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The words stung, though the employee had no idea why. They were trapped in a conversation they hadn't been invited into, and yet, it felt as though the manager had claimed the right to dissect and control every moment of their existence. It felt like a violation of something deeply personal, as if their very presence was being scrutinized under a microscope. "Well, as I was saying," the manager continued, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "We'll have to see if you're capable of improving. You've been a bit inconsistent lately. I expect results. Understand?" The employee nodded, but inside, a storm was brewing. They had always prided themselves on their work ethic. They had always strived to do their best, to meet expectations, to be reliable. But it felt as though the manager's standards were shifting, as if there was an invisible line that they were never meant to cross. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how much effort they put in, it would never be enough. As the meeting finally ended, the employee left the manager's office, the weight of the conversation settling heavily in their chest. They walked back to their desk, feeling the eyes of their coworkers on them, knowing they had just witnessed something real, something awful that couldn't be ignored. But what could they do about it? They had no allies. No one had stood up for them, not in that moment, not ever. It was a cold, lonely realization that sank deep into their bones. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that the manager's power wasn't just in his words. It was in the way he had managed to isolate them. It was in the way the office had turned into a place of whispers and sidelong glances. He had created a culture of fear, a culture of complicity, and no one was brave enough to speak out. As the days passed, the employees' unease grew. It was no longer just about the manager's comments or the strange dynamic in the office. It was about the growing sense that something much larger was at play, something that no one had the courage to confront. The manager had become a figurehead of a deeper problem, one that ran beneath the surface of the company, one that no one dared to address. The employee tried to find comfort in the idea that things would improve over time, that the tension would eventually fade and things would return to normal. But deep down, they knew better. They had seen the cracks. They had seen the way the manager played his games, how he manipulated the dynamics of the office, how he used fear to control everyone around him. And now, they were trapped in it. One afternoon, as the employees sat at their desk, trying to focus on their work, they saw a familiar face approaching from across the room. It was one of the colleagues who had been avoiding them, someone who had seemed to distance themselves ever since the incident in the manager's office. They were walking with purpose, their expression unreadable. The employee's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was someone finally going to step forward and say something? The colleague stopped in front of their desk, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. But then, with a deep breath, they spoke. "I don't know what happened between you and the manager," the colleague began, their voice low, cautious. "But I just want you to know you're not alone. It's not just you." The words were like a bomb, but they didn't ease the burning question in the employee's mind: what did this colleague mean? Were there others who had felt the same way? Were there whispers of dissent, of people who saw through the manager's facade? Or was this just an attempt at offering empty comfort, a fleeting gesture that would disappear as quickly as it had appeared? Before the employee could respond, the colleague quickly added, "But be careful. It's not safe to talk about this here. Not now. Just watch your back." And with that, the colleague turned and walked away, leaving the employee in a sea of questions. What was going on? Who else knew? And most importantly, why was everyone so afraid? The rest of the day passed in a blur, the employee's mind consumed with the cryptic conversation. The manager's cruel treatment. The strange behavior of their coworkers. The unexplained shift in the office atmosphere. They knew that something was terribly wrong, but every attempt to make sense of it only seemed to deepen the mystery. The question lingered in the air: how much longer would they stay silent? How much longer could they let fear rule the office, let the manager's manipulations go unchecked? They had no answers. Not yet. But one thing was clear: the clock was ticking, and the truth was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. The days after the cryptic conversation with their colleague felt like an endless stretch of time, each hour heavier than the last. The employee couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time, that the calmness of their everyday routine was just an illusion, a fragile barrier holding back something darker. The manager's icy glares had become more frequent, his presence more oppressive, and the subtle manipulations continued to take root in the office. It wasn't just his words anymore. It was the way he held power over everyone, the way his shadow loomed over every conversation, every decision. Each day, the employee found themselves drawn further into a web they couldn't escape. The workplace had become a battleground of silent alliances, hidden resentments, and fractured relationships. No one seemed willing to confront the truth, to call out the manager for what he was, for the toxic atmosphere he had created. The tension in the office had reached a boiling point, but no one dared to let it spill over. Instead, they all wore masks, pretending everything was fine, all while knowing that the air between them was thick with unspoken truths. Then came the day that would change everything. It was late afternoon when the employee received an email from the manager. The subject line was simple, almost casual: meeting request. No explanation, no context. Just those two words, and already, a sense of dread curled in the pit of the employee's stomach. They stared at the screen for a long moment, wondering if this was the moment everything would come to a head. Was the manager finally going to reveal his true intentions? Was he going to make good on his earlier threats, or would this be some other kind of game? There was no time to think about it. The employee knew they had to go. They could feel the pressure mounting as they walked toward the manager's office, every step heavier than the last. The same cold, impersonal room awaited them, but today, it felt different. Today, it felt suffocating. When they entered, the manager was standing at the window, staring out over the city skyline. For a moment, he didn't acknowledge their presence, as if he were lost in thought. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, before the manager finally turned around, his eyes cold, his smile tight. "Close the door," he said, his voice flat. The employee did as instructed, the door clicking shut behind them with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. They couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, that whatever was about to unfold would be the breaking point. The manager looked at them with a strange mix of amusement and disdain, as if he were about to deliver some devastating blow, something they wouldn't be able to recover from. "Do you know why I called you here?" the manager asked, his voice low, almost teasing. "I'm not sure you fully understand what's at stake here. You've been difficult. You've made things more complicated than they need to be. I'm not sure if you're trying to get under my skin, or if you just don't know how to play the game." The employee's heart raced in their chest. The manager's words felt like daggers, each one meant to wound, to break them down. But the employee couldn't show weakness. They couldn't let him see that his words were having an impact. Instead, they stood tall, shoulders back, eyes unwavering. "I don't know what you're talking about," the employee replied, their voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm just doing my job." The manager's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only a chilling sense of superiority. "You think it's that simple?" he asked, taking a step forward. "You think you can just show up and expect everything to fall into place? You think the rules are the same for everyone? You're not special. You never were." The words stung more than they should have, but the employee held their ground, refusing to let the manager see how deeply they were affected. They could feel the walls closing in around them, the weight of the room pressing down on their chest. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if every word the manager spoke was another nail in the coffin of their future at this company. "Let's get something straight," the manager continued, his voice growing colder, harder. "You don't belong here. You never did. This company doesn't need people like you. People who think they can do whatever they want, who think they can ignore the way things work around here. I've been patient with you. But I don't have time for that anymore." The employee's mind raced, trying to make sense of the manager's words. What did he mean by people like you? Was this a personal attack, or was he trying to manipulate them into some kind of confession? The tension in the room was unbearable, and the employee couldn't help but feel like they were trapped, cornered in a situation where every move they made would have dire consequences. "I've been watching you," the manager said, his tone soft but menacing. "And I know exactly what you're capable of. But let me make this clear, you'll never be able to work here. Not with the way you carry yourself. Not with the way you think you're above everyone else. So, consider this your final warning. Change your attitude, or you'll be gone before you even realize it." The employee's heart pounded in their chest. They could feel their palms sweating, their breath coming in shallow bursts. This was it. The breaking point. The moment everything they had worked for could slip away in an instant. But they weren't ready to give up. Not yet. With a deep breath, they forced themselves to speak. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of losing this job. But I will not let you bully me. I won't let you get away with this." The manager's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of something surprised, perhaps, passing through his eyes. But just as quickly, it was replaced with cold indifference. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. "You've pushed me too far. You've made it personal." Before the employee could respond, the door to the office opened suddenly, and someone else walked in. It was the same colleague who had spoken to them earlier, the one who had warned them to be careful. They stood in the doorway, looking between the manager and the employee, their face a mixture of concern and fear. "I think this needs to stop," the colleague said quietly, their voice barely above a whisper. This isn't right." The manager's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, the employee saw a flicker of genuine anger cross his face. "What's this? You're taking their side now? You think you can challenge me too?" The colleague didn't back down. "I'm not challenging you. I'm just saying this has gone too far." For a moment, the room was filled with an unbearable silence. The tension between the three of them crackled, a palpable energy in the air. The employee could feel the storm that was coming, but they had no idea how it would all unfold. Was this the moment when the truth would finally be revealed? Would the manager's reign of fear come to an end? Or was this just the beginning of something darker, something even more dangerous? The employee's heart raced as the final, inevitable confrontation loomed closer. The manager was cornered. The colleague had spoken up. But in that moment, no one could predict how it would all unfold. Would the truth come to light, or would it be buried beneath layers of deceit and manipulation? The answer seemed just out of reach. But one thing was clear: the next few moments would change everything. The silence in the room seemed to stretch on, thick and suffocating, as the manager stared down the colleague who had just intervened. The employee could feel the weight of the moment, could sense that everything was about to shift. The manager, once so composed and in control, was visibly shaken. For a split second, there was a crack in his armor, a brief glimpse of something vulnerable. It was fleeting, but it was there. The employee's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the turning point? Was the manager finally being exposed for what he truly was? But before anyone could speak, the door to the office slammed open once again, and this time, it wasn't the colleague who had entered. The figure that walked in was unfamiliar, a person the employee had never seen before, but there was an air of authority about them that immediately commanded attention. The stranger's gaze was cold, calculating, their eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that made the air grow even colder. The manager straightened, his expression shifting from anger to something more guarded, something the employee couldn't quite place. The newcomer's presence was like a tidal wave crashing into the fragile calm they'd been clinging to, and it left everyone reeling. "Is there a problem here?" the stranger asked, their voice low, but with an undeniable edge of command. The manager, who moments before had been on the verge of erupting, immediately took a step back, lowering his eyes in a gesture of submission that struck the employee as strange. This wasn't the manager they had come to know, the domineering figure who had controlled the office with an iron fist. This was someone who feared this newcomer. The employee watched in stunned silence as the manager stammered, his usual control slipping. "And no problem at all," he said quickly, his voice losing the confidence it had once held. "Everything's fine here. Just discussing some things with the employee." But the newcomer wasn't fooled. They turned their gaze on the employee, eyes narrowing as they sized them up. "I've been following your performance," the stranger said, their voice cold and dispassionate. "And frankly, I'm not impressed. You've been causing too many disruptions." They gestured to the tension in the room. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that's not tolerated here." The employee's stomach dropped. For a brief moment, it felt as if the world was closing in around them. The weight of the newcomer's words hit harder than anything the manager had said, as if they were being judged not just for their actions, but for their very existence within the company. The chill in the room grew sharper, and the employee could feel every inch of their resolve crumbling. How had they gotten here? How had things escalated so quickly? The manager, still visibly shaken, seemed to shrink further into himself, as though the newcomer's mere presence had drained him of whatever authority he once had. I wasn't aware it had gotten this far, he mumbled, his usual arrogance gone. I thought we could handle this internally, but it seems. I wasn't fully aware of the situation. The stranger's eyes flicked to the manager, and there was a brief, almost imperceptible flash of something disappointment. Anger? It was hard to say. But whatever it was enough to make the manager's shoulders sag, and he stepped back, hands raised in a placating gesture. The employee, still standing there in a haze of confusion and mounting dread, couldn't process everything happening so quickly. Who was this person? And why was the manager so terrified of them? The questions were piling up, each one adding to the already overwhelming weight of the situation. I'll handle it from here, the stranger said, their voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The employee's head snapped to them, their heart pounding in their chest. What did they mean by that? Handle it? Was this the end? Were they about to be fired, their future in the company slipping away in an instant? But before the employee could respond, the stranger gave a barely perceptible nod to the colleague who had stepped in earlier. You! Stay, they commanded. I'll need you to make sure this doesn't escalate any further. The colleague hesitated for a moment but then nodded, their face a mixture of reluctance and fear. The employee's mind was spinning. They could feel the room closing in, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. What was going on? How had the situation gone from a simple disagreement to this tangled mess of power plays, threats, and fear? The newcomer didn't waste any time. They turned to the manager, their voice low and dangerous. You'll need to make sure this never happens again, they said, their words precise and deliberate. I'm giving you one chance to resolve this, but don't think for a second that you'll be allowed to run things into the ground. The manager didn't answer. He simply nodded, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the edge of his desk. The stranger's gaze flicked back to the employee, and for a moment, it felt like the world stopped. Everything was suspended in a tense, suffocating silence. The employee could feel their pulse racing, could feel the eyes of both the manager and the colleague boring into them, waiting for some kind of response. But what could they say? They had no answers. No way out. They were caught in a trap they had never seen coming. The newcomer took a final step closer, their eyes locked on the employee. You've been a problem, they said, their voice cold and clinical. But this is your last chance. Don't make me regret it. The weight of those words hit the employee like a punch to the gut. Their mind was swirling, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. Was this a test? A final ultimatum? The room felt impossibly small, the tension unbearable. The stakes had never been higher, and yet, the employee still couldn't see the way out. And just like that, the newcomer turned, heading for the door without another word. The manager, still visibly rattled, didn't even look up as they left the room. As the door closed behind them, the employee was left standing there, the world suddenly quieter but no less menacing. The silence was suffocating. The conflict had escalated beyond anything they could have imagined. And now, they were left wondering, what was the newcomer really after? What was the manager hiding? And most terrifying of all, what did the future hold for them in this nightmare of power, manipulation, and fear? The employee took a slow, shaky breath, the weight of the situation threatening to crush them under its intensity. The battle was far from over. But with every passing moment, they couldn't help but feel like they were sliding deeper into a hole they might never escape. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Every interaction in the office felt like it was charged with electricity, every glance heavy with unspoken questions. The manager was quieter than ever, retreating further into his shell, while the colleague who had intervened seemed to grow increasingly distant, their behavior becoming more guarded as if they too were caught in the web of something bigger than they had bargained for. And yet, despite all the tension, nothing seemed to change. It was as though everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the next move in this twisted game to be revealed. Then, one fateful afternoon, it happened. The employee had just finished a meeting, their nerves still raw from the strange encounters of the past few days, when they received another unexpected message. It was from the same mysterious figure who had intervened before, the one who had come in like a storm and left with nothing more than a chilling promise. The email was short, no pleasantries, just a single line: "Meet me in my office." Now. The employee's heart skipped a beat. It was happening again. The air in the office seemed to thicken around them as they made their way down the corridor, each step heavier than the last. The tension that had been hanging over them like a storm cloud was about to come to a head, and they couldn't help but wonder if they were about to face the consequences of their actions. When they arrived at the door, they hesitated for a brief moment, wondering what was in store for them. Taking a deep breath, they knocked, and the cold, commanding voice of the stranger called them in. Inside, the room felt different. The newcomer was sitting at their desk, their posture rigid, but there was something new in their eyes, a calculation that sent a chill through the employee's bones. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sit down," they ordered, their tone firm, their eyes never leaving the employee. The employee complied, sitting across from the stranger, feeling the weight of the moment bearing down on them. "What's this all about?" the employee asked, their voice barely above a whisper, their nerves beginning to fray. "What do you want from me?" The newcomer's lips curled into a smile, but it was not one of reassurance. It was a smile that hinted at something darker, something hidden. "You still don't understand, do you?" they said, leaning forward, their eyes gleaming. "This isn't about you, or your performance. This is about power. This is about control." The employee's mind raced, but they couldn't make sense of it. Power? Control? Was this all just a game to the stranger? Were they being manipulated this entire time? The newcomer continued, their voice low and deliberate. "You've been the pawn in this little chess game from the beginning. But you're not the only one. The manager? Just a puppet. The real question is who's pulling the strings." The employee's breath caught in their throat. What were they hearing? Were they finally going to learn the truth about everything that had been happening? Before they could speak, the newcomer raised a hand, silencing them. "You think this is just about you and the manager, don't you? But you're wrong. There's more at play here than you realize. This whole company? It's part of a much larger scheme. A network of power, manipulation, and secrecy that goes far beyond anything you've imagined." The employees' heads spun. They had been so focused on the manager, on their own struggles, that they hadn't seen the bigger picture. What was this stranger talking about? What did they mean by a network? And why were they telling them this now, in the midst of everything else? The newcomer leaned back, their gaze piercing. "You've made a choice," they said, their voice cutting through the confusion. "You could have stayed quiet. You could have played along with the system, just like everyone else. But you didn't. You spoke up. And now you're caught in the middle of something much bigger than you ever anticipated." The employee's pulse quickened, the weight of the situation sinking in. It wasn't just about the manager. It wasn't just about the office politics, it was about a system that had been in place long before they'd ever walked through those doors. They had been brought into something far more dangerous, something they weren't prepared for. "And now," the newcomer continued, their voice cold as ice, "I'm giving you a choice. You can walk away, pretend none of this ever happened, and leave with your career intact. Or you can stand up, fight for the truth, and risk losing everything." The words hit the employee like a punch to the gut. Everything was at stake. Their career, their future, their very sense of self, all of it could come crashing down if they made the wrong decision. But then, the unexpected happened. Just as the employee opened their mouth to respond, the door to the office flew open, and the manager stormed in, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic. "Stop! Stop this right now!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "You don't know what you're getting into." The newcomer didn't flinch, their gaze unwavering. "You should have kept your mouth shut," they said, their voice calm, almost disappointed. "But it's too late for that." The employee's mind was racing. What was going on? Why was the manager suddenly so desperate? Had he known the truth all along? Were they both being used as pawns in some larger scheme that had yet to be fully revealed? Before anyone could speak again, the stranger's phone rang. They glanced at the screen, their face momentarily tightening, and then they stood, their expression hardening. "I've got to go," they said, their voice curt. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot. But remember this, there's more to the story than you can see." With that, they turned on their heel and left the room, leaving the employee and the manager standing there in stunned silence. The manager, shaking with fear, finally spoke, his voice trembling. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," he whispered. "None of us do. This isn't just a company, it's a web of power that goes way beyond anything you can imagine." The employee felt their stomach drop. This wasn't over. Far from it. The truth was out there, but it was tangled in a web of lies and power that they were only beginning to understand. As they stood there, the weight of the choices before them grew heavier with each passing second. What path would they take? What would be the cost of uncovering the truth? And more terrifying still, who could they trust when it seemed like everyone had their own hidden agenda? In the quiet that followed, the employee knew one thing for certain: the story was far from over. And whatever came next, they would have to face it head on, no matter the consequences. The silence in the room felt suffocating as the employee stood frozen, absorbing the full weight of the manager's words. None of it made sense, and yet, somehow, everything seemed to be falling into place. There had been hints, small whispers of something darker underneath the surface of the office politics, something that no one had been brave enough to confront until now. The stranger's cryptic words, the manager's fear, and the looming presence of this larger, hidden force were more than enough to make the employee realize they were no longer just a participant in a work environment, they were caught in the middle of something far beyond their understanding. The manager, still trembling, seemed to snap back to reality as he finally broke the silence, his voice low, almost pleading. "You don't get it," he said, his eyes darting around the room as though trying to find an escape. "You've seen the surface, the drama, the petty fights. But that's just a distraction. They've been watching us, watching you. For a long time. This isn't just about power, it's about control. A system that manipulates everyone, from the highest executive to the lowest employee. And you're the one who made the mistake of getting too close." The words were heavy, and for the first time, the employee saw the manager not as the domineering figure they had once feared but as a man caught in his own web. His confidence had been replaced with desperation, a fear of something larger, more powerful, than any of them could have imagined. The employee's heart raced as they tried to process everything. The company they had worked for, the place that had promised a future, now seemed like the epicenter of something far darker than they had ever believed. "What do you mean?" the employee asked, their voice trembling. "What's really going on here? Who are these people, and why are they doing this?" The manager took a step back, glancing nervously at the door as though afraid someone might be listening. "You've been unknowingly caught in the middle of a power struggle that has been going on for years. These people, this organization, they control more than just the company. They have ties everywhere. In politics, business, law enforcement. It's all connected." And he stopped, as if realizing the gravity of what he was about to say. "I've been part of it. I've been helping them." The employee's mind was spinning, the implications of the manager's confession sinking in. "You're telling me this whole company is some kind of front?" they asked, struggling to keep their voice steady. The manager nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. Not just a front. A network. A web of influence that manipulates people from the inside out. They don't just want control over this company, they want control over everything. And if you keep digging, if you keep pushing for answers, you'll become a target too. The employee felt a cold chill run down their spine. This wasn't just about the manager's cruelty, or the newcomer's strange behavior, it was about something much bigger, something with the power to tear apart everything they thought they knew. But despite the fear creeping in, there was also something else rising within them, a resolve. The employee wasn't going to back down. They had come too far, seen too much, to just walk away. If this was the truth, then they had to expose it. No matter the cost. What happens now? The employee asked, their voice firm, even though their hands trembled. What do we do? The manager's face hardened, a flicker of resignation in his eyes. You don't have a choice. You either play along, pretend you didn't hear anything, and stay silent, or you face the consequences. They won't stop. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their secrets. And if you're smart, you'll stay out of it. But even as he spoke, the employee knew they couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after everything they had learned. The weight of the situation hung heavy, but they felt a spark of defiance growing inside them, a desire to confront the darkness they had uncovered. In the days that followed, the employee spent every moment digging for answers, carefully piecing together the fragments of information they had gathered. It wasn't easy. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. The deeper they dug, the more they realized how deeply this organization had infiltrated every corner of society. Their influence was insidious, reaching far beyond the company walls. The stranger's words echoed in the employee's mind. There's more to the story than you can see. They were right. And with every new piece of information, the employee felt the walls closing in, the web of power tightening around them. But despite the mounting danger, they pressed on. The truth was out there, and they weren't going to let fear stop them from finding it. Finally, after weeks of investigation, the employee discovered something that would change everything. It wasn't just the company at the center of the operation, it was a larger network, a consortium of powerful figures who had been pulling the strings for years. They had set up a system where individuals like the manager, like the newcomer, were just puppets, carrying out orders for a much larger agenda. The truth was even more terrifying than the employee had imagined. This wasn't just about power or money, it was about control on a global scale. But as they uncovered more, something unexpected happened. The employee began to realize that they weren't the only one uncovering the truth. The manager, too, had been working behind the scenes to gather evidence, to bring the network down from within. And now, their fates were intertwined in a way neither of them had anticipated. They had become unlikely allies in this dangerous game, bound by the need to expose the truth and bring the corrupt system to its knees. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. One evening, as the employees sat in their office, piecing together the last of the puzzle, they received a call. It was from the manager. His voice was shaky, and there was a sense of urgency that sent a shiver down the employee's spine. They know, the manager whispered, barely able to contain his panic. They know what we've been doing. It's over. The employee's heart sank. It was happening. The network was closing in, and there was no way out. But instead of fear, the employee felt a strange sense of clarity. This was the moment they had been preparing for. It was now or never. I'm coming, the employee said, their voice steady despite the turmoil inside them. We're going to finish this. When they met with the manager, it was clear that everything had escalated. The weight of the situation had pushed both of them to the edge, but they weren't backing down. Together, they gathered the evidence they needed to expose the network for good. It was a risky move, one that could cost them everything, but it was the only move left. They knew that the final step would be the most dangerous. The higher-ups would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But as they prepared to take everything they had learned public, the manager pulled the employee aside, his face grim. "I never wanted this," he said quietly, his eyes filled with regret. "I was part of the system for too long. But now it's time to bring it all down. No matter what happens." And then, with the final pieces of the puzzle in place, they exposed the network to the world. The fallout was immediate. The public was stunned as the truth came to light. The corruption, the manipulation, the powerful figures pulling the strings, it was all laid bare. The company crumbled, its leaders exposed for the world to see. But as the dust settled, there was a sense of relief, of justice served. The employee had made it through. They had survived the web of deceit and had emerged victorious, though not without scars. They had learned the hard way that nothing in life was as it seemed, that power and control were far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. But in the end, they had taken down the system that had tried to destroy them, and in doing so, they had found their own strength. As the story came to a close, the employees stood at the edge of a new beginning, their journey far from over. They had faced darkness and come out the other side, stronger and wiser than before. And though the world had changed, one thing remained the same: the truth always finds a way to come to light.